You're standing in front of your bathroom mirror, half awake, the fluorescent light humming a low clinical B flat above your head. You're performing the mundane ritual of the morning, brushing your teeth, checking for a new gray hair, or perhaps just staring blankly at the dark circles under your eyes. You don't think twice about the person looking back at you. You don't need to. You know with a certainty that sits deeper than logic that the tired eyes and the messy hair belong to you. That image in the glass is an anchor. It is the physical proof of your existence. You and the reflection move in a perfect, silent choreography, a two-dimensional ballet of identity that you have practiced every single day of your life since you were a toddler. But then, the bathroom door creaks open. Your cat wanders in, tail twitching with idle curiosity. It's a creature of refined instincts, an apex predator in a miniature frame, possessing senses that far outstrip your own. But then, it catches a glimpse of the mirror. In an instant, the domestic peace of the room is shattered. The cat's back arches into a jagged mountain of fur. Its pupils dilate until its eyes are nothing but voids of black ink. A low, guttural hiss vibrates through the floor tiles. The cat isn't looking at itself. It is looking at a stranger. It is looking at an intruder that has somehow materialized inside the walls of its own territory. A silent, odorless ghost that mimics its every move with terrifying, mocking precision. In that split second, a profound divide opens up in the center of the room. A cognitive chasm that separates you from almost every other living thing on this planet. To you, the mirror is a simple tool of self-confirmation. But to your cat, to your dog, and to 99% of the biological world, that glass surface is a haunting physical lie. It is a window into a world populated by phantoms. It is a glitch in the engine of reality that their brains were never designed to solve. Why does this happen? Why is it that a creature as sophisticated as a feline, a being that can calculate the trajectory of a leaping moth in pitch darkness, cannot grasp the simple fact of its own reflection? To find the answer, we have to understand that the mirror is what scientists call an impossible object. In the 4 billion-year history of life on Earth, reflective surfaces were a rarity. Perhaps a still pond on a windless day or the polished surface of a volcanic rock. Evolution never had to prepare the brain for the experience of seeing its own face. There was no selective pressure to develop a self-recognition circuit because for most of history, you didn't need to know what you look like to survive. You only needed to know what your mother looked like or what a predator looked like. When an animal looks into a mirror, it is receiving a massive influx of data that its brain cannot categorize. Think about the sensory conflict. When you encounter another animal in the real world, you get a full spectrum experience. You smell their musk, you feel the heat radiating from their skin, you hear the rhythmic thrum of their breathing, but the stranger in the mirror is different. It is a sensory vacuum. It has no scent. It emits no warmth. It makes no sound. It is a creature made of nothing but light. For most animals, this creates a state of cognitive dissonance. Their eyes tell them there is a rival standing 2 feet away, but their nose tells them they are alone on the rug. Their ears tell them the room is silent, but their eyes see a creature baring its teeth. This conflict usually leads to one of two reactions, aggression or indifference. The dog barks at the phantom because the visual evidence of a stranger is too high to ignore. The cat eventually walks away, not because it has figured it out, but because the intruder doesn't smell like anything. And in the world of a cat, if you don't smell, you don't truly exist. But there is a deeper, more unsettling layer to this. It isn't just that they don't recognize the image, it's that most animals may not even possess the concept of a self to begin with. Consider what identity actually is. To you, the self is a continuous story. It is a mental construct that allows you to say, I am the one inhabiting this body. This requires a massive amount of neural processing power. It requires your brain to integrate your internal sense of movement, what we call proprioception, with the external visual data you receive from the world. When you move your arm and the person in the mirror moves their arm, your brain performs a lightning-fast calculation. I feel my arm moving, and I see that arm moving. Therefore, that image is me. Most animals lack the hardware to perform that calculation. They see the movement in the mirror, but they cannot map it to the internal sensations of their own muscles. To them, the reflection is just a highly synchronized coincidence. It's a puppet whose strings they cannot see. They are trapped in a perpetual present tense, a world of pure reaction where the boundary between me and the world is a blur. This brings us to a terrifying thought. If you cannot recognize your own reflection, do you truly know that you exist as an individual? Or are you just a series of biological impulses, a sophisticated machine that responds to hunger, fear, and light, but never stops to wonder who is pulling the lever. We have spent centuries assuming that we are the masters of our own identity. We take our self for granted because we see it every morning in the bathroom. But as we dive deeper into the labyrinth of the mirror test, we're going to find that the ability to look at a reflection and say, "That's me," is perhaps the rarest and most fragile gift in the universe. It is a biological hallucination that only a handful of species have ever managed to achieve. In the next chapter, we are going to leave the bathroom and enter the laboratory. We're going to look at the man who decided to put this mystery to the test using nothing but a can of red paint and a group of chimpanzees. We are going to witness the moment the ghost in the glass finally gained a name. And we will see the exact second that a wild mind realizes, for the first time in its life, that it is not alone in its own head. In 1970, a psychologist named Gordon Gallup Jr. walked into a laboratory at Tulane University with a simple question and a can of red, odorless dye. At the time, the world of psychology was a cold, clinical place dominated by behaviorism. The prevailing wisdom was that animals were essentially biological machines, complex input-output devices that responded to stimuli with reflexes, but possessed no internal world, no soul, and certainly no sense of self. To suggest that a chimpanzee had an identity was considered scientific heresy. It was anthropomorphism, the cardinal sin of projecting human feelings onto a beast. But Gallup suspected that the behaviorists were wrong. He had watched chimpanzees for years, and he saw something in their eyes that suggested a someone was home. He just needed a way to prove it. He needed a bridge between the subjective experience of the chimp and the objective observation of the scientist. He started by placing 4 wild-born chimpanzees in individual rooms, each equipped with a large, full-length mirror. For the first 2 days, the chimps behaved exactly like your cat or dog. They saw the reflection and they saw a rival. They lunged at the glass, they hooted, they displayed their teeth, and they performed aggressive threat gestures. They were convinced that a strange chimp had invaded their space. This was the social phase. To the chimps, the mirror was a window into a hostile world. But on the 3rd day, something shifted. The aggression began to fade, replaced by a quiet, eerie curiosity. The hooting stopped. The lunging ceased. The chimps began to use the mirror in a way that no animal had ever been seen doing in a laboratory. They began to perform self-directed behaviors. Gallup watched through a one-way glass as a chimpanzee approached the mirror, opened its mouth, and used its finger to pick a piece of food out of its back molars, a part of its body it had never seen before. Another chimp turned its back to the mirror and craned its neck to look at a wound on its rear. A third began to groom the hair on its underarms, staring intently at the reflection to guide its fingers. In that moment, the mirror had transformed. It was no longer a window to a stranger. It was a tool for the self. The chimps had realized that the movement they felt in their muscles was perfectly mirrored by the movement they saw in the glass. They had bridged the gap between the internal me and the external image. But Gallup knew that observation wasn't enough for a skeptical scientific community. He needed a smoking gun. He anesthetized the chimpanzees, putting them into a deep, dreamless sleep. While they were unconscious, he took the red, odorless dye and carefully painted a small mark on the upper ridge of their eyebrows and on the top of one ear. These were blind spots, areas the chimps could not see without the help of a mirror. When the chimps woke up, they were given time to get used to the room again. They touched their faces, but they didn't touch the marks. They didn't know the red dye was there because they couldn't feel it, and they couldn't smell it. Then Gallup reintroduced the mirror. What happened next is now legendary in the annals of biology. Within seconds of seeing their reflections, every single chimpanzee reached up and touched the red mark on their own face. They didn't touch the mirror. They didn't try to groom the other chimp in the glass. They touched their own skin, then looked at their fingers, then went back to the mirror to investigate further. This was the birth of the mirror self-recognition test, or the MSR. It was the first time science had produced a yes or no answer to the question of animal consciousness. By touching the mark, the chimpanzees were saying something profound. They were saying, "That image over there is me, and there is something wrong with me." To do this, a brain must be capable of mental representation. It must have a pre-existing idea of what its body looks like. It must have a self-schema stored in its memory. When the chimp looks in the mirror, it compares the live video feed of the reflection with the stored file of its own face. When it sees the red dot, it detects a data mismatch. It realizes that the reality of its body has changed. Gallup's experiment sent shockwaves through the scientific world. It suggested that self-awareness wasn't a uniquely human gift granted by a divine hand. It was a biological trait that emerged from a specific kind of neural complexity. It proved that at least one other creature on Earth was capable of looking at the universe and realizing that it was a distinct, separate entity within it. But this discovery opened up a much more disturbing Pandora's box. If chimps could pass the test, who else could? If self-awareness was just a product of brain evolution, why did so many other smart animals fail? Why do monkeys, the close cousins of chimps, stare at the mirror and see only a stranger until the day they die? Gallup's red dot became the ultimate dividing line. It created an elite club of nature, a small, prestigious circle of species that could look into the silver surface and recognize a soul. But as the years went on, the members of this club would become increasingly strange. We would find that the ability to see the self wasn't just limited to our hairy cousins. It was hidden in the depths of the ocean and even in the tiny, buzzing brains of insects. In the next chapter, we are going to dive into the water to meet the most mysterious members of the Mirror Club. Well, we're going to look at creatures with no hands to touch their faces and no hair to groom, who yet possess an obsession with their own reflection that rivals our own vanity. We are going to explore the dolphin paradox and what happens when a mind without a body like ours still manages to find itself in the glass. We tend to think of the self as a pinnacle, a final prize at the top of the evolutionary ladder. After Gallup's work with chimpanzees, the scientific community assumed that self-awareness was a primate luxury, something reserved for the creatures with hands, thumbs, and high-functioning cortexes. But as the mirror was introduced to the rest of the animal kingdom, the elite club began to admit some very unexpected members. This wasn't just a story about monkeys anymore. It was a story about how evolution, under the right conditions, keeps reinventing the concept of me. Imagine descending into a world where your hands are useless. In the vast sapphire depths of the ocean, the tool user logic of the primate doesn't apply. Here, we meet the bottlenose dolphin. These are creatures with a brain-to-body ratio second only to humans. They live in fission fusion societies, complex, shifting networks of alliances, friendships, and rivalries that rival any human soap opera. In 2001, researchers Diana Rice and Lori Marino decided to see if a mind designed for the water could still navigate the silver surface of a mirror. They placed large underwater mirrors in a dolphin tank at the New York Aquarium. The reaction was almost immediate, but it looked nothing like the primate version. Dolphins have no hands to touch a mark. They have no fingers to pick their teeth. Instead, they use their entire bodies as a diagnostic tool. The dolphins began to perform posturing. They would swim to the mirror and flip upside down to look at their bellies. They would open their mouths wide, staring at the arrangement of their teeth. They would blow bubbles in intricate patterns, watching the silver spheres rise in the reflection. Most strikingly, when the researchers applied a temporary mark to parts of the dolphin's body that they could not see, such as the underside of a fin, the dolphins didn't just swim past. They spent significantly more time in front of the mirror, contorting their bodies at impossible angles to inspect the spot. This was the first time a non-primate had passed the test. It suggested that self-awareness wasn't tied to having a human-like body. It was tied to a specific kind of social intelligence. This brings us to the social mirror hypothesis. Why would evolution bother to build the hardware for self-recognition? Why would a dolphin or a chimp need to know what they look like? The answer is likely other people. In a high-stakes social group, your survival depends on your reputation. You need to know how others see you. You need to understand that when you make a specific face or take a specific posture, it sends a signal to the tribe. To navigate a world of others, you eventually have to develop a concept of me. We see this logic on an even grander scale with the Asian elephant. In 2006, at the Bronx Zoo, an elephant named Happy was presented with a massive, jumbo-sized mirror. Elephants are deeply emotional, social giants. They mourn their dead. They cooperate to protect their young. When Happy saw her reflection, she didn't just see a large animal. She saw Happy. She used the mirror to look inside her mouth, a place she had never seen in her decades of life. When a large white X was painted on her forehead, she used her trunk to touch the mark repeatedly. But then, the VIP club got even stranger. In 2008, the neocortex rule was shattered by a bird, the Eurasian magpie. Birds do not have a neocortex, the part of the brain we always assumed was the seat of the soul. Their brains are structured completely differently, built on a dense architecture of clusters rather than layers. And yet, When magpies were marked with a bright yellow sticker on their throat feathers, they used a mirror to scratch at the sticker until it fell off. This was a biological earthquake. It meant that self-awareness had evolved twice, independently, in two completely different types of brain hardware. It suggested that identity is a universal solution to a specific biological problem. It's as if the universe wants intelligence to eventually turn around and look at itself. But if the club is so prestigious, why are so many other geniuses left at the door? This is where the mirror test begins to feel like a rigged game. Consider the dog. Your dog can navigate a forest, remember 100 commands, and sense your sadness before you even feel it. Yet, your dog will fail the mirror test every single time. It will bark at the intruder until it's hoarse, or it will simply ignore the glass with a bored yawn. Does this mean your dog has no soul? Does it mean your pet is just a mindless automaton? As we move into the next chapter, we're going to challenge the very foundation of the mirror test. We're going to find that for some of the smartest creatures on Earth, the mirror is a failure, not of their intelligence, but of ours. We've been testing them with our eyes, forgetting that for most of the wild, the eyes are the least reliable way to tell who is standing in the room. We're about to discover the scent mirror and the yellow snow experiment that proved the self might not be an image at all. It might be a smell. Step outside on a crisp autumn morning with your dog, and you are immediately participating in a ritual that is as ancient as it is invisible. To you, the walk is a simple loop around the block, a chance to stretch your legs and breathe some fresh air. But to the creature at the end of the leash, you are navigating a dense, four-dimensional library of information. Every fire hydrant, every blade of grass, and every corner of a brick wall is a page in a chemical ledger. Your dog isn't just sniffing, it is reading the news. It is identifying who passed by, how long ago they were there, what they ate, and what their emotional state was. In the world of a dog, seeing is a secondary, almost primitive way of gathering data. Their primary interface with reality is through the nose, a sensory organ equipped with up to 300 million olfactory receptors, compared to our measly 6 million. Their brain's olfactory bulb is, proportionally, 40 times larger than ours. For a dog, a world without smell would be like a world without light for you. And yet, when we brought dogs into the laboratory to test their self-awareness, we used a mirror. We used a piece of glass that offers zero olfactory data. It is one of the great scientific blind spots of the 20th century. We designed a test for primates, by primates, and then we were shocked when the rest of the animal kingdom failed it. We concluded that dogs lacked a self because they couldn't recognize an image in a mirror. But this is like asking a blind person to prove they exist by describing the color of their own eyes. It isn't a failure of the dog's intelligence, it's a failure of our imagination. In 2017, a cognitive scientist named Alexandra Horowitz decided to fix the game. She realized that if we wanted to find the self in a dog, we had to stop looking in the glass and start looking in the yellow snow. She designed what she called the scent mirror test. The experiment was elegantly simple. Horowitz collected urine samples from a group of dogs. She then presented each dog with a series of canisters. One contained the dog's own scent, another contained the scent of a stranger, a third contained the dog's own scent but with an olfactory mark added, a tiny drop of anise or some other chemical that changed the smell without masking it. The results were a perfect olfactory echo of Gallup's chimpanzees. The dogs barely spent any time sniffing the stranger or their own normal scent. They already knew those. But when they encountered their own scent with the added chemical, they spent significantly more time investigating it. They realized that the scent of me had been tampered with. They detected a mismatch between their internal olfactory map and the external data. By the rules of science, this counts as passing the test. The dogs were demonstrating that they have a mental representation of their own chemical identity. They were saying, "This is me, but something is different." This discovery forces us to rethink everything about the elite club. It suggests that self-awareness isn't a visual luxury, it is a sensory necessity. If you are a social animal, whether you are a dog, a wolf, or a hyena, you need to know where you end and the world begins. You need an identity to navigate the hierarchy of the pack. You just don't need that identity to be an image. Think about the profound difference in how we perceive me. For you, your identity is the face. It is the thing you see in the mirror every morning. It is the thing you see in photographs and ID cards. Because we are visual primates, we have externalized our identity. We have projected it onto a surface. But for a dog, the self is a cloud. It is a shifting three-dimensional envelope of pheromones and chemistry that follows them through space. It is a me that exists in time, because a scent has a past, a present, and a future. When a dog sniffs its own scent, it isn't just looking at a static image, it is experiencing its own history. This scent mirror revelation should make us feel a bit less special. It suggests that we have been judging the entire planet by a very narrow, very human standard. We assume that if an animal doesn't behave like us, it isn't thinking like us. We take our visual ego and we make it the yardstick of the soul. But if identity is just a sensory loop, if it can be built out of light or smell or even sound, then the mirror test isn't a test of being. It's a test of hardware. And if the hardware doesn't have to be a massive primate cortex, then where does the self stop? We've seen that huge brains like dolphins and elephants can find themselves. We've seen that dogs can find themselves in a cloud of scent. But what happens when we look at a creature that shouldn't even have enough RAM to run the software of the self? What happens when a creature with a brain smaller than a grain of sand, a brain that has no right to be conscious, looks into a mirror and realizes it's looking at a person? In the next chapter, we are going to confront the cleaner race paradox. We are going to meet the tiny fish that shattered the big brain theory of self-awareness. We are going to find out what happens when a pea-sized brain passes a test that a highly intelligent rhesus monkey fails. We are going to ask, is the self a masterpiece of evolution, or is it just a cheap biological trick? For decades, the Mirror Club was a gated community. To get in, you needed a massive brain, a complex social life, and ideally, a neocortex. We had constructed a hierarchy of the soul where humans sat at the top, followed by the great apes, then the dolphins, and perhaps an elephant or a magpie. This hierarchy made us feel safe. It suggested that self-awareness was a high-end feature, the biological equivalent of a luxury software package that only the most advanced biological hardware could run. But in 2019, a small striped fish from the coral reefs of the Indo-Pacific swam up to that gated community and demanded to be let in. Its name is the cleaner race, and its brain is smaller than a grain of rice. The cleaner race, Labroides dimidiatus, lives its life in what can only be described as a nature's doctor's office. It sets up a cleaning station on the reef where larger, often predatory fish come to have parasites, dead skin, and infected tissue nibbled away. This is a high-stakes job. The race must be an expert at pattern recognition. It has to distinguish between a healthy scale and a harmful parasite. It has to read the body language of its clients, to know when they are satisfied and when they are about to snap their jaws shut. Because of this intense focus on the physical surface of other creatures, a biologist named Masanori Koda at Osaka City University wondered if the race might also be an expert at the physical surface of itself. Koda placed a mirror in a tank with several races. At first, they followed the standard script. They attacked the intruder in the glass. But after a few days, the behavior changed. They began to perform mirror testing. They would hover in front of the glass, perfectly still, and perform strange rhythmic dances, accelerating and decelerating to see if the reflection followed. They would swim upside down. They would stare into the mirror's eyes. Then, Koda applied the mark. He injected a small amount of brown gel under the skin of the fish's throat, a place the fish could only see in the mirror. He chose brown because it looked exactly like the parasites these fish spend their entire lives hunting. What happened next sent a shockwave through the world of cognitive science. The fish swam to the mirror, saw the brown mark on its throat, and immediately dove to the bottom of the tank. It began to rub its throat against the rough sand of the floor, attempting to scrape the parasite off. Then it swam back up to the mirror to check its work. If the mark was still there, it went back to the sand. If the mark was gone, it stopped. The cleaner race had passed the mirror test. The scientific community reacted with a mixture of awe and outright anger. Some experts refused to accept the results. They argued that the test must be flawed, or that the fish was merely reacting to a parasite stimulus, rather than a self-concept. But why was the reaction so visceral? Why did it matter so much if a tiny fish recognized its reflection? Because if a creature with a brain of 100,000 neurons can pass the same test as a human with 86 billion neurons, then our gated community of the soul is a lie. It means that self-awareness might not be a pinnacle of intelligence at all. It might just be a biological trick, a cheap, efficient loop of feedback that any brain can run if it's required for survival. For the race, knowing what its own body looks like is a job requirement. It needs to know which parts are me and which parts are the client. It's not consciousness in the way we think of it, it's just high level maintenance. But the paradox goes deeper. If a fish can do it, why can't a rhesus monkey? Rhesus monkeys are highly intelligent primates. They have social structures, they use tools, and their brains are far more similar to ours than a fish's. Yet, in every mirror test, they fail. They look at the glass and they see only a stranger forever. This is the hardware versus software problem. It suggests that self-awareness isn't just about having a big brain, it's about having the right neural pathways open. The monkey's brain is powerful, but for some reason, the self-recognition app won't install. Maybe it's because for a monkey, direct eye contact is such a violent threat that the brain shuts down any higher level processing the moment it looks into the mirror's eyes. The monkey's fear blocks its identity. And then there are the ants. In 2015, researchers in Belgium marked the clypeus, the face of Myrmica ants with small dots of blue and green paint. When these ants were placed in front of a mirror, they began to groom their own faces, trying to remove the paint. They only did this when a mirror was present. An ant, a creature whose entire brain is the size of a pinhead. This leads us to a terrifying existential conclusion. If a fish and an ant can recognize their reflections, then perhaps the self isn't a gift. Perhaps it isn't a sign that you are a special being with a soul. It might just be a basic sensory tool like binocular vision or the ability to feel heat. We have spent our entire history using our self-awareness as the proof of our divine status, but the cleaner rasa suggests we might just be running a very old, very simple piece of biological code. But if the self is so simple, why does it feel so profound? Why do we feel like there is a someone sitting inside our heads looking through our eyes? To answer that, we have to look inside the hardware itself. We have to look at the specific cells that act as the internal eye. In the next chapter, we are going to look at the me circuit. We are going to meet the spindle cells, the specialized neurons that only exist in the species that pass the mirror test. We are going to find out where exactly the eye is located in the meat of your brain. We're moving from the reflection in the glass to the electricity in the skull. We're going to find out what happens when the hardware of the self is built, and what happens when it begins to break. If you were to hold a human brain in your hands, you would be holding about 3 pounds of wet, wrinkled, gray pink tissue. It feels like soft tofu or firm jelly. It is composed of roughly 86 billion neurons, firing electrical signals at speeds of up to 270 miles per hour. On the surface, there is nothing about this lump of meat that suggests it is the seat of a self. There is no I written in the folds. There is no tiny pilot sitting in a cockpit behind your eyes. And yet, somehow, this biological machine produces the most complex illusion in the known universe, the feeling that you are a someone. For a long time, neuroscience treated the self as a ghost, a philosophical mystery that was too slippery to pin down in the lab. But as we began to scan the brains of creatures that passed the mirror test, we started to find something remarkable. We began to find the hardware of the soul. It turns out that self-awareness isn't just a general byproduct of having a lot of brain. It is the result of a very specific set of specialized cells that act as a high-speed telecommunications network for the ego. In the late 1920s, a neurologist named Konstantin von Economo discovered a rare type of neuron in the human brain. Unlike the standard pyramidal neurons that look like bushy trees with thousands of branches, these cells were long, elegant, and shaped like spindles. They were giants. While a normal neuron is like a local radio station, these von Economo neurons, or VENs, are like transcontinental fiber optic cables. They are designed for one thing: speed. They allow distant, unrelated parts of the brain to talk to each other in a fraction of a second. But for decades, we didn't know what they were for. It wasn't until we started looking at other animals that the pattern emerged. We found VENs in the brains of great apes. We found them in humpback whales and orcas. We found them in Asian elephants. Do you see the pattern? Every single species that possesses these spindle cells is a member of the mirror club. So these neurons are located in two very specific regions, the anterior cingulate cortex and the frontal insula. In humans, these are the areas that light up when you feel embarrassment, when you feel empathy, or when you look at a photograph of yourself. These cells are the internal eye. They are the hardware that allows a brain to monitor its own internal state. They bridge the gap between, I feel a twitch in my muscle, and I see that twitch in the mirror. They allow for social monitoring, the ability to wonder, what does that other person think of me? Without these long-distance cables, the brain remains a collection of isolated islands. You might feel hunger, you might feel fear, but there is no central me to tie those feelings together into a story. This hardware is incredibly expensive, biologically speaking. It takes a massive amount of energy to maintain these giant neurons. This is why most animals don't have them. For a squirrel or a frog, the self is a waste of resources. A frog doesn't need to wonder how it looks to other frogs, it only needs to catch the fly. Evolution is a ruthless accountant, and for 99% of life on Earth, the identity app simply isn't worth the cost of the hardware. But this brings us back to our tiny friend from the previous chapter, the cleaner rasa. This fish has no neocortex. It has no anterior cingulate cortex. It certainly has no spindle cells. And yet, it passed the test. This suggests a terrifying possibility. If a tiny fish can recognize itself without the high-end hardware, then perhaps there are two ways to build a self. Then there is the high road, the expensive social, emotional identity of the human and the whale. And then there is the low road, a cheap, functional, maintenance-only identity that can run on a brain the size of a pinhead. The ras might not feel embarrassment or ego. It might not have a soul that wonders about the meaning of life. Its self might just be a piece of diagnostic software, a way to keep its own body clean so it can continue to work. But for us, the hardware of the self is much more fragile. Our I is built on a specific, delicate architecture of neurons that didn't even exist for most of Earth's history. Because our self-awareness is tied to specific hardware, it means that you can be turned off. It means that the self isn't a permanent ghost. It's a temporary electrical state. If those spindle cells are damaged by trauma, by disease, or by a glitch in development, the mirror stops being a mirror. We see this in the most haunting clinical cases in neurology. There are people who, after a stroke or an accident, can still see, still speak, and still think, but they can no longer find themselves in the glass. They look at their own reflection and they see a stranger, a stalker, or a ghost. The hardware has snapped and the me has leaked out of the brain. As we move into the next chapter, we're going to look at the mesa of the self. We are going to explore the moment a human baby, a creature born without a sense of identity, finally boots up its own hardware. We're going to see the exact second the red dot is touched. And then we are going to look at the dark side. What happens when the mirror breaks and a human being becomes a stranger to their own face? We are moving from the elite club of nature to the fragile club of humanity. Every human being watching this was once an animal in the eyes of a mirror. When you were 6 months old, you had no self. You were a beautiful, bubbling void of sensory inputs. If your parents held you up to a mirror back then, you didn't see a reflection. You saw a friend. You laughed at the other baby, you tried to touch its nose, and you peered behind the glass to see where the playmate had gone. At 6 months, your brain lacked the long-distance fiber optics, those von Economo neurons, to connect the me you felt inside with the me you saw outside. You were living in the same perpetual present tense as a cat or a dog, but then, somewhere between the age of 18 and 24 months, something incredible happened. A silent explosion occurred in your prefrontal cortex. The hardware matured. The me circuit booted up. This is what child psychologists call the mesa of the self. If your parents had performed the rouge test on you during this window, sneaking a bit of red lipstick onto your nose while you weren't looking, they would have witnessed the exact second you became a self-aware being. One day, you would have looked at the mirror and instead of laughing at the other baby, you would have stopped. You would have grown quiet. You would have reached up and touched your own nose. In that quiet domestic second, you left the animal kingdom behind. You realized that you were a distinct entity, a character in a story, a someone who exists in the eyes of others. But because this self is built on hardware, it is hauntingly fragile. If the ability to recognize yourself is a gift of brain development, then it can also be taken away. There is a dark, clinical territory in neurology where the mirror stops being an anchor and becomes a source of absolute terror. Consider the condition known as mirrored self-misidentification. It usually happens after a stroke or a traumatic injury to the right hemisphere of the brain, specifically the areas responsible for integrating your body's internal map with your visual world. Imagine waking up in a hospital bed. You feel like yourself, you remember your name, your childhood, and what you had for dinner last night. You walk to the bathroom to wash your face. You look in the mirror, but you don't see yourself. You see a stranger. This isn't face blindness or prosopagnosia where you can't tell one face from another. This is much worse. You know what a face is. You recognize your spouse and your doctor, but when you look at the person in the mirror, you are convinced it is a stalker. You see someone who is perfectly mimicking your movements with a mocking, predatory precision. You talk to them and they move their lips, but they don't speak. You move to the left and they move to the left. Patients with this condition have been known to cover every mirror in their house with bedsheets. They become prisoners in their own homes, haunted by a phantom that lives in every reflective surface: the toaster, the window pane, the polished floor. They haven't lost their intelligence. They have lost the neural bridge that allows the brain to claim an image as its own. The me has been severed from the image. And this reveals a terrifying truth. Your self is not a permanent soul. It is a biological hallucination maintained by a very specific set of wires. If those wires fray, you disappear even while your body remains. We see the same fragility in patients with late-stage Alzheimer's. They often lose the ability to recognize their own reflection long before they lose the ability to speak. They will spend hours talking to the stranger in the mirror, sometimes becoming angry with them, sometimes trying to offer them food. The mesa of the self that they crossed as toddlers has crumbled. They have returned to the state of the cat and the squirrel, trapped in a world of phantoms, unable to find the eye in the glass. What does this tell us about the animals that fail the test? If a human being can lose their self through a simple neural glitch, perhaps we should stop looking at the animal world as lesser. Maybe the dog and the monkey aren't missing something. Maybe they are just living in a world that doesn't require the burden of an ego. We have spent this entire journey looking into the mirror, trying to find the someone looking back. We've looked at the red dots on chimps, the scent maps of dogs, the tiny brains of fish, and the fragile circuits of human infants. But now we have to face the final, most unsettling question of all. If the self is just a piece of hardware, a biological tool used by a handful of species to survive, then what is the mirror actually showing us? Are we truly in there? Or are we just a sophisticated simulation, a biological program that has learned to recognize its own output? In our final chapter, we leave the lab and the nursery behind. We are going to look at the cosmic mirror. We are going to ask why, in a universe of billions of galaxies and trillions of stars, we are the only ones, as far as we know, who have ever stopped to look at our own reflection and wonder why. We are going to find out if the self is a gift or a cage. So we return to the bathroom mirror. The fluorescent light is still humming. The cat has long since wandered away, bored by the silent stranger in the glass. You are alone again with your reflection. But after everything we've explored, the red dots on chimpanzees, the scent clouds of dogs, the tiny rice grain brains of fish, and the fragile spindle cells in your own skull, the image looking back at you feels different. It feels less like a solid fact and more like a high-wire act. You realize that you aren't just looking at a face, you are looking at one of the rarest phenomena in the known universe. We have spent this journey trying to understand why the rest of the animal kingdom fails to find itself in the glass. We've looked for the glitch in their brains, but perhaps we've been asking the wrong question. Perhaps the real mystery isn't why they fail, but why we succeed. In the vast, cold expanse of the cosmos, self-awareness is not the rule. It is a staggering, improbable exception. For 4 billion years, life on Earth flourished without mirrors. Trillions of creatures lived, hunted, mated, and died in a state of pure, unreflective being. They were part of the scenery, as unaware of their own existence as the wind or the waves. Evolution is a relentless accountant. It doesn't grant superpowers for free. Every neural circuit, every specialized cell must pay for itself in the currency of survival. So, why did the universe bother to build a self? Why did it take the risk of creating a creature that can turn its attention inward? The answer is both practical and profound. The self is a social tool. It emerged when the world became too complex for simple reflexes. When you live in a tribe, your greatest threat isn't a predator, it's the mind of your neighbor. To survive, you have to predict what they are thinking. You have to understand their intentions, their grudges, and their desires. And to understand them, you eventually had to create a model of you. You needed a self so you could simulate how you appear in the eyes of the group. Self-awareness was the price we paid to become the most social species on Earth. But this social tool came with a massive existential side effect. It gave us the mirror of the mind. Because we can see ourselves, we can also see our own limits. We are the only animals that know we are going to die. We are the only animals that can feel the crushing weight of what if. We are the only animals that can look at our own history and feel regret, or look at our own future and feel anxiety. The cat in the hall doesn't have to worry about its legacy. The dog doesn't stay awake at night wondering if it's a good dog in a moral sense. The cleaner rasa doesn't experience a midlife crisis. By failing the mirror test, they are granted a kind of peace that we can never truly know. They are spared the burden of the ego. They are allowed to simply be without the constant nagging interference of a someone watching from the inside. In this sense, the mirror isn't just a gift, it is a cage. It traps us in a perpetual loop of self-observation. We have turned a piece of glass into a temple of vanity and a torture chamber of insecurity. We spend our lives curated, filtered, and reflected, obsessed with an image that, as we saw in the clinical wards of neurology, could vanish with a single broken wire in our brain. We are the only creatures on earth that can be lonely even when we are with ourselves, because we are the only ones who have split the world into me and everything else. But there is a second way to look at the mirror gap. The astronomer Carl Sagan once famously said that we are a way for the cosmos to know itself. Think about the staggering scale of that statement. For billions of years, the universe was dark and silent. Stars exploded, planets formed, and black holes swallowed entire solar systems in total anonymity. There was no one to witness the glory of the pillars of creation. There was no one to hear the music of the spheres. The universe was a masterpiece in an empty gallery. But then, on a tiny wet rock orbiting a mundane yellow star, the hardware of the self began to click into place. A few species, the apes, the dolphins, the elephants, the magpies, began to peek behind the curtain. And then, we arrived. We built the mirrors, we polished the glass, we turned our gaze inward, and in doing so, we gave the universe an eye. When you look in the mirror, you are performing a cosmic audit. You are the universe looking back at its own reflection and wondering, why? The self is the bridge across the silence. It is the only thing that allows the chaos of matter to become the beauty of experience. Without the eye in the glass, the universe is just physics. With the eye, it becomes a story. So, the next time you see your dog bark at the stranger in the hall, or you watch your cat hiss at its own shadow, don't feel superior. Don't laugh at their failure. Instead, feel a sense of envy. They are living in a state of pure, unadulterated reality, free from the hall of mirrors that is the human ego. They are at home in the world in a way that you, with all your spindle cells and your self-reflection, will never be. But as you turn off of the bathroom light and walk back into the dark, remember the red dot. Remember the moment the chimpanzee touched its own brow. Remember the mesa of the self you crossed when you were 2 years old. You are part of an incredibly small, incredibly fragile club. You are a member of the only species that has ever turned a glitch of light into a definition of a soul. The mirror isn't showing you who you are. It's showing you that you are. And in a universe that spent 13 billion years in total darkness, that is the only miracle that matters. The question isn't why they can't see themselves. The question is, now that you can see yourself, what are you going to do with the story?